Yeah, all right. Like I believe like we are good to go. So I could see like people are joining in. So before jumping into the actual conversation, so first of all, thank you so much everyone for joining us for the today's session. I hope like everyone is doing good and safe at your home. Um, and no, like this is our fourth Magento Master Virtual Series, and DCKAP has been actively organizing Magento meetups in Chennai for more than 5 years. And however, during the lockdown, that has affected, I would say, like least of quarter of the world's population because of the COVID-19. So we are looking for some other means to organize the meetups. So our idea was to rope in the Magento Masters for the virtual meetups to share the insights or to get to know from them. So our first virtual meetup happened, a month ago, and it was indeed a great success, I would say. So almost like 120 people turned up for this, and that success made us go forward to rope in more Magento masters to join these. So we just thought like, no, why not facilitate such meetups moving forward? And I would say like here we are, and we are in the fourth Magento Masters Virtual Series, a bi-weekly event, and especially for the Magento community across the industry. So, no, before moving on this, I would also like to use this opportunity to give a brief introduction about like what is DCKAP. Okay, so here you go for the slide. So DCKAP is a digital commerce agency specializing in building e-commerce friends for the clients abroad. And also with 15 years of experience in this industry, we have developed a handful of products that allows brands and businesses to unleash their potentials. So our jumping into our product suite, like we have Productimize, a product customization platform, and Chorus, an automated integration tool between ERP, CRM, and e-commerce stores. And we have FlexiPIM, a product information management platform, and last, QA Touch, a smart test management platform. All that said, and thank you so much, Jisse and Muliadi, for honoring our stage. And I don't want to hold off you guys from hearing how the capitative sessions by the wonderful speakers lined up for this day. I'm sure that you will have a great learning experience today. And let me call Jennifer to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrija. Thanks for calling me in, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. I hope you all have a wonderful start to the session. So, guys, I'm not going to keep you waiting anymore. So, let's move on to the first speaker. We have Jisse Reitsma with us, and he is the owner, developer, and the trainer of Yireo, providing numerous Magento extensions to the community, but also training front-end developers and back-end developers throughout Europe. He was awarded a Magento Mastership for organizing user group meetings, hackathons, and developer conferences like Mage Test Fest and Reacticon. He was a part of the XDN and Magento Extension Development Network. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Jesse. So over to you.
Yeah, perfect. It's awesome to be joining you with a meetup like this. Joining you from the Netherlands, and I believe actually most of you are from India. I can see a couple of other names actually not being from India, but that's the perfect thing of an online meetup, of course, that we can join from wherever you are, mostly from home. Yeah, and I prepared a little bit of a presentation for you guys. So let's share my screen, just a second. There we go. And there we go. So you should all be able to see my screen, which is a little bit of presentation about Magento 2 and GraphQL. So I'm actually not sure who's listening to this meetup, whether it's developers or less technical people or people that have never heard of GraphQL in the first place. So that's kind of like a challenge. Well, and to slowly go into the presentation, actually to explain a little bit also what the whole presentation is about. So Jennifer actually did a great job already of introducing me. So my name is Jisse Reitsma. I'm joining you guys from the Netherlands. I'm a founder of a little company called Yireo, and as Yireo, I've been developing actually extensions for quite some time now already. I believe I actually started with Magento 1.0, so that's I guess like 14 years ago or so. Created my first Magento 1 extension. Got through a lot of experiences, and then sooner or later, when Magento 2 popped up, I also started to deal with Magento 2, of course. Since then, I've been training people, mostly developers, into the extending upon Magento 2. And it might be hopefully not that much news to you, but Magento 2 was shipping this this front end based upon technology that seemed to be outdated as soon as it came out as a stable release. So Magento 2.0 shipped basically with a couple of JavaScript frameworks, specifically Knockout and Require. And from a JavaScript point of view, basically those libraries were already outdated. Well, and then on top of it, these libraries were building building a whole front end, including a checkout and cart behavior, which was basically part of a bigger story of the front end development, dealing with XML layout, PHTML templates. And as soon as I basically started to train people to use that system, the primary feedback that I basically got was, oh my God, this is so complicated. And the more developers actually switched from Magento 1 to Magento 2, the more of these stories came to being as well. Which is basically the point where I wanted to bring up, which is basically leading into yet a totally different story. The story basically of React and Vue. So again, this is not going to be really like an introduction to React and Vue, but in short, if the Magento 2 frontend itself introduced Knockout and Require as main JavaScript libraries to do stuff dynamically, basically React and Vue were already there, kind of. And their more modern approaches of dealing with things in JavaScript, they're far more popular than React or than the Require.js and Knockout.js frameworks in Magento 2 itself. And sooner or later, basically, this whole development led into something else that I'm even not going to mention that much in my slides, but a little thing called PWA. So I know actually a lot of developers are currently playing around with PWA technology. Basically, PWA stands for Progressive Web App. And it's kind of like a technology or set of technologies or set of features that you can build. And there's many technologies out there to help you build all of those features as well. And that's basically where React and Vue come in. I'm still only like introducing myself and also the story that I hope to unravel for you guys. But basically, it's bringing you along with the same story that I'm currently in myself as well. So I'm just a guy also interested in technology, and I find Magento 2 complex, but I find it interesting as well. To build basically complex frameworks or complex e-commerce shops as well. And React and Vue are simply attempts to make the front-ending part at least easier than the traditional Magento 2 front end. I started to train people in it. I started to organize also various conferences with that. So Mates Test Fest was a conference I organized still last year. That was in Italy. Was kind of interesting for me as a Dutch person to go over to another country like Italy and start up basically a new conference there. While the year before that, so now we're talking about 2018, I organized Reacticon twice. And the resemblance between Reacticon as a front-end developer conference name, that name, and the resemblance with React as a front-end technology is no coincidence. So Reacticon was basically all about PWA, React, but also Vue. So there's various solutions also in the PWA market out there. React is, for instance, used by Magento PWA Studio, and Vue is used by another partner called Vue Storefront. And basically all of those technology partners were there at Reacticon. So in 2018, I organized Reacticon 1 and 2. And then actually, I was supposed to organize Reacticon 3 in only less than 2 weeks' time, so early June. Well, then a little thing came along, the COVID virus. Long story short, Reacticon is not going to happen this June, and we're still looking into whether we can reschedule things into October. But at this moment, the chaos is just complete, and the impact on economy is also complete. So it might be that Reacticon is even postponed till to next year. Sorry. So yeah, the introduction is basically also that I'm busy with a lot of other things. I'm still developing my extensions. I'm training a lot of people. I was awarded three times Magento Master. I'm also part of this network called XDN, Extension Developer Network. And with XDN, we hope basically to increase the quality level of extensions, which is always like a difficult thing within the Magento market, within the Magento ecosystem, to make sure that basically adding extensions to your own shop doesn't break that shop to start with. And then maybe back again to the whole story that this talk is actually about, headless, React and Vue and GraphQL. To my vision, basically, GraphQL is there basically to help us move into a different strategy with Magento so that extensions no longer do a lot of things at once, a little bit of things on the front end and some things in the back end and etc. But that we actually focus upon the different needs. And the needs basically for Magento is to make sure that e-commerce as a whole is just working in a nice way, and in a solid way, extensible and ready for enterprise and well, so on. While actually the front end is supposed to be disconnected from that whole story so that we're able to use whatever front end tool is out there, like React or like Vue, but theoretically also Svelte or Angular or a lot more. And this disconnection between between the front end and the back end is often referred to as headless. And Magento is then a headless application that is connecting towards whatever kind of front end is there. And basically the glue between this front end and the back end is called GraphQL. It almost feels like a long story, long introduction towards something that I really want to go into detail with, but bear with me. I've got a reason also to explain this step by step, because it's not only about the technology, but it's also about what kind of business needs do we have, and maybe also a broader question, what do you guys need to do to actually get started with GraphQL? So that's where the story starts. GraphQL, it stands for Graph Query Language, and query language basically means that from a client you can request data from a server. So the client might be something like React or Vue, while the server in this case is then Magento. And instead of just being a single replacement of REST, basically GraphQL is offering many features on top of it. So there's this concept of that you're only fetching what you need and all that you need. So that's referring to a terminology of overfetching, that with REST, let's imagine that you want to fetch a certain product, and then that product has an SKU and a price and a description. So what you do with REST is you call upon a certain URL, and then you get all of the information from that URL. So basically, if that URL is a representation of a product, you get all of those details from that product, including its SKU and a short description and a pricing and so on. But if you would only be interested in the SKU, it's kind of like a waste, that you're going into REST, you're calling upon URL to fetch all of that product information, and you're getting a lot more basically than what you actually required. And that's basically where GraphQL comes in. Within the request itself, you're requesting that same thing that you actually want to have. So there's no overfetching and there's no underfetching. So that's part of the coolness, and I'll explain to you in a bit, a little bit better, like how it's working and how to get started. Some other things are things like bundling multiple requests in one. It's also something I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail. And then there's advanced stuff. And I'm not really going to dive into this advanced stuff except for a couple of things that I've been building myself. And that's basically Magento extensions, improving basically the GraphQL endpoints of Magento. And hopefully that's useful for all of you. First of all, the basics. The basics are that from within a React environment or a Vue environment, you can make a connection towards the API, the GraphQL API of Magento. And basically, there's multiple clients to make such a connection. There's shell clients. There's a client called GraphQL. There's multiple PHP solutions out there, and there's Node. And the most interesting part about this last phrase, Node clients, is basically that if you know that React and Vue are actually written in JavaScript, just like Node is just a variation of JavaScript, then basically this boils down that you can have connections, GraphQL clients from within a React code base to connect to Magento as well. And later on, I'm going to display a little bit of an example of how to get going there. But I try to always take you there step by step. So first of all, there's the basic step of making a curl request from the shell, which could be looking a little bit like the following. It's a little bit technical. You need maybe Linux or some kind of other shell environment to make a post request like this. Curl is basically a bare bones command to make any kind of web request. With the X, we identify that it's a post request. There's a specific header that needs to be sent to Magento content type application JSON. And then basically the next 3 lines are the query itself, which is kind of like unreadable. But I'll dive into the usefulness of things like this later on. And the last line is basically that there's this connection or this URL of Magento itself. Well, the URL that you can see on screen here is not really helpful to you because it's not a public URL. Likewise, I've got this other URL basically set up for this presentation, which is also only available as a local development environment. But basically, that's the environment that we see here. So m2.sirius.yr. YR standing for my company name, Sirius, I don't know, because I like star systems. But anyway, so it's a default Luma theme with also a backend. You're all familiar with Magento 2 itself, I assume. And basically what I could do is simply just post or simply request a certain page from Magento itself / GraphQL. And this is actually what I do more often just to check whether Magento 2, the GraphQL API layer, is there at all. Because earlier with the release of Magento 2.3, this was added to Magento 2 itself. So if you have an environment, a Magento 2.2 site, there's no GraphQL API there. On the other hand, we now have Magento 2.3 sites, but there's even methods available online on the web to remove GraphQL again from the whole system as well. So having a Magento 2.3 site doesn't necessarily mean that GraphQL is available. And for me, a little check just to see whether it's available or not. It's just to simply browse to it. And if I see this specific error, I know basically that GraphQL is there. It's just that I'm not sending GraphQL the right request. So I could basically use a simple shell to send that request. However, that's a little bit cumbersome. It's a little bit difficult to use. So instead, there's another tool called GraphQL. The I maybe stands for improved or interactive, or I don't really know. But GraphQL basically is a tool that you could install in multiple ways. And what you can currently see is that there's this GraphQL client running in my browser. So I'm using Chrome, and within Chrome, there's this GraphQL client. So that's actually Chrome IQL. And actually, I've heard people pronounce GraphQL as graphical. So maybe Chrome IQL is chromical. So the naming of things is kind of interesting, but that's the client. And now basically what you can do is you can start typing on the left-hand side. And for instance, what I could do is I could fetch the absolute footer from the store configuration, press play, and then I get a response from Magento 2 itself. Now in this case, I've not added anything to the footer page of basically the theme configuration. But maybe let's look up another value like the base currency code, which is set now to US dollars. And this is all referring to basically fields or values that are saved to the Magento store configuration. So if I would go into the store configuration myself, I could modify certain values right here, and basically whenever I modify values here in the configuration, I can see that popping up basically in the GraphQL client as well. Now, the whole point on why this GraphQL client is basically called interactive is also because as soon as I basically start typing, or specifically in my environment, if I start typing space shift, then I get a pop-up of all of the possible endpoints that are currently here in this specific Magento instance. And using Magento extensions, I can extend upon these endpoints. I can change them, I can modify them, and I can add additional endpoints as well. And the cool part is basically that as soon as you found out, for instance, that there's this product listing, then you can play around with this interactive client as such. So for instance, I can fetch from this product's endpoint specific items, so that's products, and per item I could just fire up like, hey, show me all of the SKUs belonging to this product's endpoint. And normally you would say like, oh, but then you're done and you press play. But just beware that sometimes the GraphQL interactive client is not actually predicting or discovering all of the features in GraphQL itself in a natural way. So sometimes basically it's good to have an error on the right hand side that guides you into basically using such an endpoint properly. And specifically basically in this case, the product's endpoint needs a couple of input arguments as well, and which is basically either search or filter. And the filter variation is basically kind of like the API that you're used to use more or less with collections if you're a backend developer. But the search is always like the easiest thing to start with, because using a search, I can search for products starting with dress or something. Well, that's no match, maybe hoodie. And then I can see basically multiple matches coming from that listing. And now on top of it, basically, I can search for other values that are stored towards the Magento database. So there's an ID per product. There's still the description per product. However, some of these values actually should be written down as a more complex form. So consider basically an ID or a color or an SKU as plain and simple values, while a description could be called like a complex value or an object kind of like response, so that you need to specify basically an HTML subquery in this description as well. Let's play and let's see basically the results. Well, the coolness about GraphQL basically starts with knowing about GraphQL. And because thanks to GraphQL, you can just discover what is there in the API, play around with it, and then see basically that you can fetch JSON data from Magento in a very flexible way. And then imagine yourself basically building your own front end. So regardless of Magento, but just within Angular or Vue or React, or maybe even some kind of Laravel system, or I don't really care what kind of system you're using, but not just the dictated form of the Magento front end, but any kind of front end that you would like to use. And then you can simply import these JSON data and start playing with it, and then slowly build step by step this whole strategy of a PWA basically, or a headless front end. So back to the slides. that's the introduction of how to get playing with GraphQL. There's multiple tools, there's multiple ways of dealing with GraphQL. So this is just not like the through or the thorough listing of all of those tools, but it's more like giving an impression of what is yet to come. And then the second phase, as I mentioned already, that's basically that you come to the realization that there's actually a lot of queries and a lot of things, a lot of information that you can retrieve from Magento. And basically what I did in the past was just write down all of these queries so that I could easily copy and paste those queries from between different code bases. So this is also something that is derived from my own notation or my own way of dealing with things. A product query, also allowing you to fetch a listing of all of the URL rewrites under which basically this specific product is known for. And you can imagine basically that stuff like this could be integrated theoretically to build like a menu or a listing of products on some kind of category page. Some other examples just to get you going, like there's a CMS page endpoint within Magento, and it requires you to specify basically the ID of the specific CMS page that you want to intercept. Likewise, there's a CMS blocks endpoint. So in this case, multiple. So CMS page is singular. It requires you to, or it allows you to fetch a single page. And CMS blocks is the multiple, so that it allows you basically to return multiple CMS blocks identified by their own ID or code, or I'm not sure anymore like how it's being called in the Magento 2 backend. And another funny thing is basically also that you can see here one single query that could be sent as one single HTTP request towards Magento as well. So let me see if I simply can copy and paste this. Well, actually, in this case, the CMS block doesn't really exist, but maybe I added an example here. No, so I don't know anymore like what kind of CMS blocks are there. Maybe there's no CMS blocks. But the response is still interesting, as in that we get the data back as in errors. I'm not doing the query part in a proper way. However, the CMS page is also still being returned. Plus, there's also still the return of the CMS blocks itself, even though there's no value attached to it, because actually there's an error of me not requesting the right thing. So basically in this little example, you can see that there's two requests and kind of like three different responses. And that's basically also boiling down towards one of the principles of GraphQL. We're trying to retrieve resources from Magento in such a flexible way, so as to minimize basically the traffic over the web. So it's just plain JSON that we're exchanging with Magento, and it's also that it could be that I'm retrieving multiple parts of Magento at once, so that the Magento Bootstrap is also kickstarted only once as well. So basically, it's a couple of nice things that we can see simply by looking at a plain slide like the one before. Likewise, URL queries. But I'll skip this this part for now. It's just a reference for you guys later. Later on, I'm happy to share my slides basically with everybody, so that you can copy and paste from these examples yourself and start playing basically with GraphQL. So far, but what I've been telling you is basically that you can explore GraphQL by looking at an interactive client like GraphIQL. But in real life, what you will be doing is actually integrate GraphQL into some kind of front-end technology. And that could be Vue, that could be React. But even more, you could also build this from scratch, which is actually the little example that I'm going to show you. Or what you could do is you could base your work upon the PWA that is already built by somebody else. And that somebody else could be Magento itself. So Magento is releasing this product called Magento PWA Studio. And Magento PWA Studio is using React and GraphQL and a couple of other technologies to allow you to build your own PWA. take this literally, the name. PWA Studio is not there to help you build a simple PWA by clicking through some kind of wizard. No, it's there actually for React developers, for developers within React, to allow them basically to build their own PWA. So PWA Studio is offering the developer tools to actually build your own PWA from custom code. However, the benefit is still that a lot of the code is already there. So you don't need to build a checkout or the whole state management of React itself. You don't need to build that from scratch. It's a lot of base ground that you already have. Likewise with Vue, there's Vue Storefront. There's also numerous other PWA providers out there. But what I always try to do is basically, if we're going to dive into GraphQL, we need to get the basics straight. And that counts basically the same for React as well. So I always encourage you to get playing basically with a little example with React, and then add GraphQL to it, so that you get the feeling like what kind of technology is involved here by building a PWA based on React, so that later on you can make that leap into PWA Studio itself as well, or build it from scratch, or well, make proper decisions. The starting point of React is often that you get started with this little tool called Create React App, which basically allows you to build your own PWA and then add things to it and add your own code and custom code and etc. So that's what I'm using here as well. So there's a Create React App command, which is building a whole structure for you to play with. And then you can add some other packages towards it, and that's basically Apollo in short. And what is Apollo? Well, basically Apollo is this out-of-the-box pre-configured tooling that you can use to basically make calls from React to Magento using GraphQL. And I'll show you a little example now in the next slides, but just be aware that actually Apollo is much more than these basic examples. It's also involving query, or it's involving query limitations. It's dealing with the efficiency of multiple queries sent at more or less the same moment. It's allowing for caching. There's a lot of opportunities basically in there. The basic thing about React is first you install things, and that's a very common scenario to get started with is basically by running this command, Create React App. And then part of Create React App is that you can kickstart a whole development environment using Yarn Start. But now the specific story that I wanted to explain is how to get started basically with Magento and Apollo in detail. And literally what I always do when I want to get started in a scenario like this, I copy and paste a little code example like this into a single file like Apollo or state/GraphQL/Apollo. It's up to you to determine the name of the file, but just copy and paste things. Also make sure that that you modify the name of the Magento site. And basically, in short, this is putting together a thing called Apollo client, which is now pointing towards Magento through this HTTP link, and including kind of like a default scheme for caching, which out of the box is just fine and actually gives a pretty good performance right away. After this file has been created, you can basically see that a couple of things from Apollo are imported, but the client itself is exported. So it's not doing anything yet. However, now we can make the next point, and that is to open up the existing file of index.js. So as soon as you build up a Create React App environment, there's always an index.js file, which more or less looks as follows. The only thing that I added to it is basically the Apollo stuff. In this case, we're importing this Apollo provider. We're importing the file that we previously created. And then basically these two are put together and putting it together basically as a React component. So again, this is not a real story about how React components are coming to being, but it resembles a little bit like HTML, but it's not HTML, it's real JavaScript. But this JavaScript is then converted into basically JavaScript that runs in the browser. And Apollo provider could best seen as kind of like a an HTML element, kind of like an HTML object, but instead of it representing some real HTML element in the web page, it's only wrapping all of that HTML that lives within the app, and wrapping basically JavaScript functionality around it, so that all the components that live within the app suddenly get this behavior of the Apollo client. Again, it's kind of like a straightforward step if you're familiar already with React itself, if you already have your own Create React app environment. And then we can make it up to the real example of how to connect your own React component towards a simple Apollo GraphQL client call. Well, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm importing React. I'm importing a function called useQuery from the Apollo library. There's this other little thing called GQL, and GQL is kind of like a function which is now called upon without braces or without parentheses, but backticks. But still between these backticks, there's kind of like an argument, and that argument in this case is a string, but it's a multi-line string. And that's basically the reason also why these backticks are being used. It's ES6 behavior, modern JavaScript, but it's in this case applied just to make sure that we have this kind of plain text variable, which is representing the query that we can see below. And just to prove you that this is still a GraphQL query, what I could do is I could go back into my GraphQL environment, copy and paste, play, and then basically you can see that there is an endpoint in Magento providing dealers data. And I'll explain in a moment also how this dealers endpoint got there in the first place as well. So basically the example is showing that there's a query. There's a couple of imports, but then the real magic starts, which actually doesn't have a lot to do with Apollo. It doesn't really have a lot to do with GraphQL itself, but it has a lot to do with how React components are working. What we can see is that a React component is a function. You don't see the word function, but this is an ES6 arrow function. And basically this dealers thing is exported again as well. So this is the main purpose of this dealers.js file. And then I'm calling upon this function of Apollo, useQuery, with as argument the actual query. And basically from that moment onwards, Apollo is doing a lot of magical things. It's going to make this AJAX call towards Magento. It's going to be sending or making that GraphQL request and retrieving JSON data. But because of that, actually, I get 3 variables, loading, error, and data. And now every time when basically one of these variables is changing, the function itself of my dealers component, my React component, is re-executed as well. So the initial state of useQuery might be that loading is false, error is false, and maybe there's no data yet as well. But that also means basically that the rest of my function will be returning something silly like returning nothing because it's not loading yet, returning no error because there's no error yet, and basically also just returning an empty UL because there's no items yet from the data either because we haven't made that AJAX call yet. And then Apollo just continues with making that AJAX call. Loading is set to true. Error might be still false and data is empty, but because of loading is true, basically this time this function is being executed. And that's basically in short what a React component is all about. It's making a couple of these arguments, these loading, error, and data variables change, and whenever actually these changes are there, it's changing also the inner state of this component, and because of that inner state of that component is changed, the whole component as a whole is being re-rendered as well, and re-rendering basically means that there's a different output of HTML as well. Last but not least, in this little example, we need to put this together. And you can do that by opening up the app.js file, removing theoretically some details, importing the dealers component, and then actually just printing that details component as well. It's a little bit of a short introduction towards React. However, it was just there to prove that GraphQL could be working. So far, basically for the scenario of how to get started with React and connecting it towards Magento using Apollo as well. There's only one little downside, and that is if React is listening towards a local host port 3000, so basically a local host name and a local domain, local port, then basically it might be a different port than Magento is running upon, because earlier what I did in my example is my React client is connecting towards this external domain called m2.cyrus.yr. And that's basically where you're trying to make a connection from a web page running JavaScript within your browser towards an external resource. And that's where the browser normally actually starts to complain because of browser security, which is a good thing. And in development, this is just really annoying. In production, you really need to go after a production setup just to make sure this is working properly. But in development, what I usually do is I start with this module that I built myself, which basically just sets the course headers to be allowing for any connection between the local host domain and the Magento instance by setting a couple of HTTP headers. So just install this module and you should be working fine. And then the previous example that you'll be seeing later on when the slides are being sent is basically working or should be working for you as well. It's getting you started with playing with GraphQL. But there's another story as well, because with React, you would be calling upon the GraphQL endpoints of Magento. And whenever there's something in Magento, you can use it in React thanks to this GraphQL API layer. But what if something is not there in Magento? What if there's a specific endpoint that you need, but it's not yet included in Magento 2.3.5, which is the current version of Magento? Or maybe worse, what if there's a specific Magento extension that could not be working? So maybe there's a bug that you want to fix, which is not fixed yet by the current release in Magento. Well, I'm not diving into the whole details of how to build your own Magento modules, but I have a lot of code to share with you, and it's all online on GitHub. And maybe through that code, you can discover basically how to build your own Magento 2 module, including GraphQL endpoints as well. Plus, there's numerous tutorials already online. So instead of actually going through the whole creation of a Magento 2 module that offers some kind of GraphQL endpoint, I just want to show you a couple of examples that I've been building, which is also leading into a couple of more interesting scenarios to play with, like what kind of issues might you bump into when building your own React front end, connecting it to GraphQL with Magento as backend. So one of the examples that I wanted to show you was basically already an example that I was showing earlier in my slides as well. Let me scroll back a little bit, because in my own dealers component, I've added this dealers endpoint as well. But this query would fail with a normal Magento 2 environment, unless you would actually install this, this module called Example Dealers. It's there on GitHub. I've been using it myself actually to explain basically how to build a core module, how to extend upon a core module within the admin panel, but basically also by splitting it up, it offers kind of like an interesting approach that might be the future of Magento as a whole as well. Because imagine that you're building this headless front end in React, then you definitely want to make use of a GraphQL module. You do want to have this data that is managed within Magento available to you through GraphQL as well. And that's basically the sub module that is part of this dealer setup. However, I've split up the GraphQL approach from the regular front end with XML layout and PHTML templating and so on, because if you're going the headless way, you're not going to need this original front end anymore. Likewise, it might be, and that sounds maybe a little bit silly, but it might be that you're not needing this admin panel at all, because maybe all of the management of Magento happens through some kind of CLI. So basically, I've split up all of this functionality, so that if you're installing a Magento instance without a Magento admin panel, or you're installing a Magento instance where you don't have shell access, or you want to implement the original front end and not GraphQL, or vice versa, that there's always a subset of modules that you can build upon. While actually the only module that you really require is a core module, which is not used for advertising, but it's basically used for the core database interaction that all of the other modules are basically depending upon. So it's not only a nice little example of how to play with GraphQL, but it's also a nice little example of how to split up things within Magento. And that's basically how I got my endpoint with the dealers. But interestingly enough, there's more endpoints that I've installed already on the Magento instance that I was playing with, because by default Magento only offers this endpoint called products, multiple. But what if you already know the ID or the SKU of a specific product and you only want to load that product, for instance, on the product page? Well, currently this kind of like feels like a shortcoming in the Magento API itself. There's no product by ID or product by SKU endpoints in Magento by default. But if you install my module, which is available for free, then you can just add it as easy as well. And actually, this is again something that I'm using personally in multiple environments, because I find it really useful to get one product by its ID or SKU without actually just going through the whole products endpoint, so that default endpoint that is there. Likewise, Magento offers this endpoint called CMS blocks, which is multiple, and now there's a singular version as well. There's in Magento by default the CMS page, a singular version, but now there's a multiple version as well. CMS widgets, kind of like an experiment. I'm not sure if it's going to be useful. And then a little thing with customer token, which really has to do with the whole scenario of authentication in a GraphQL only front end, but I'll skip the whole explanation. But the main point is basically that I found it pretty easy to put together my own modules and playing around with GraphQL. So basically, a lot of these modules that I'm showing you are there for, well, for graphs. You can look at the source code, their general purpose. And one thing that I bumped into myself as well is a little bit an annoying thing, and I'll demonstrate this with hopefully a live little example as well. Basically, the endpoints of Magento are, to my opinion, about 99% complete. It might be that a couple of endpoints are still missing, specifically in the checkout. Basically, Magento is struggling with the approach with payment providers and shipment providers to make that a general approach via GraphQL. And as of yet, actually, this is going to be the hardest point of building your own headless front end, to integrate basically a payment provider and a shipment provider of your choice within your own headless strategy. But I would say basically that apart from that little area, the GraphQL API is kind of complete. And the focus upon this API is mostly that Magento is eager to stabilize the API, make sure that the functionality is complete. All of the features that you expect from GraphQL are there as well. Then they're going to focus upon performance, and then theoretically they're going to focus upon really advanced stuff. However, they're still focusing upon the features, and they might not be focused yet that much upon the performance of things. And to demonstrate that, there's a little thing that you might want to keep a secret for now. But well, I'm announcing this in kind of like an open webinar for everybody to see. And I don't consider this a secret, because basically it's something that you'll see pretty quickly that it could be an issue. And the demonstration is basically how much of an issue this could be. I'm making it really mysterious, but here we go. So earlier, what I explained was basically we can fetch a collection of products, for instance, all of the products with the keyword hood in it. And then from it, I can select the ID, for instance, and so on. And if I play this, you can see a collection of some products. And I've not limited this selection towards any kind of limit. So there's about 20 products in here. So it's a demo database, and theoretically, this little query could lead into numerous other listings. But now what I could also do is I could fetch a listing of all of the categories. And then categories is basically one of those more complex things, so that I would need to print basically the ID or the name of that category as well. So let's maybe opt for the name so that you can visually see basically what we're fetching. So far so good. So I can fetch all of the products, and per product I can fetch all of the categories where that product lives in, and now the fun stuff starts. I can also list all of the products within that category, and like that I can also list all of the IDs and names of those products, and I can list all of the categories within that. And then per category I can go into the products again, and then within the products again I can go into the categories again, and then within the products categories, and well, so on. Now this is leading into kind of like a complex query, and I'll show you the effects. Well, I'm doing something wrong here. Just a moment. So per category I need the products, and per product I can fetch all of the items, and then the items, there's the ID, and let's beautify this or prettify this a little bit. Now let's play. And this is a local environment, and I hope that actually my Zoom session doesn't die on me. Then it's a really short ending of this presentation. But basically my database is now spinning up, and it has kind of like a lot of things to do to make sure that the results are coming back. Now imagine yourself actually doing this from not only a demo environment like my own desktop, but on a production site. Imagine basically that you're not doing this only with like a recursiveness of maybe 10, but maybe 20 or 30 or 50, and so on. Basically, there's a couple of dangerous parts in GraphQL at this moment that might need patching. And therefore, one of the first recommendations I would make is if you're rolling out Magento 2.3 and you're not using GraphQL, make sure that GraphQL is disabled, either by removing all of the composer modules using replace rules, or by disabling simply all of the GraphQL modules to begin with. It might be that my Magento environment has just died, but there's another thing that I want to discuss anyway, so hopefully we can get there. Because this module on the slide is maybe solving yet another part which could be troublesome. In my own development environment, I was able to also create a query, or actually a mutation in GraphQL, which is then allowing you to create a customer record. And maybe I can play around with that a little bit, hoping that the introspection is still there. Yeah. So instead of making queries, we actually also have mutations. And what I could do is I could create a customer based on specific fields. And that field, for instance, requires that you enter as an argument an input. And within that input, you're able to add like a first name, and this could be example, well, Yireo.com or whatever. And besides that, there's a couple of other fields that you really need, and which could be a first name, and there's still last name. But as soon as I would play this mutation, without actually much delay, there's a customer created without any issues. So there's no email verification or whatever. The database record is right away created in Magento, and theoretically there's still an account activation needed, but it doesn't stop you from actually inserting a new customer record into Magento to begin with. And that's basically where this GraphQL rate limiting module kicks in. It allows you to limit how many mutations and how many queries a single user is able to make towards Magento, specifically for endpoints specifically for mutations, but I've played around with this, and basically it's pretty successful. It allows you simply to make sure that nasty stuff doesn't happen actually within a Magento site. The second module is basically leading into the other part that I was already demoing. It allows you to limit the query depth and the query complexity. Well, the query depth is kind of something simple because, well, at this moment we already had a failure, some kind of HTTP timeout. Theoretically, my Magento instance is no longer available. I don't know. But anyway, we look here at the mutation, and the mutation basically now has a depth of only 1. So the return value that you can see here basically starts with kind of like a root, and then actually a little curly brace. But now let's go back into this products endpoint. So within the products endpoint, I had the ability to fetch items, and then I had categories. And then for all of the categories, I was able to fetch products, and then items, and then an ID. And basically, then again, you need to count all of the curly braces kind of from the moment where things are being returned, which is items. And in this case, it would be a query depth of 4. Now, by default, and that's the amazing thing, actually, let me look that up. I think I've documented this somewhere in the module itself. No, not really, but if you would go into the backend of that module, and I'm not sure if that backend would be available still, but let me try. Then basically there's a query depth and a query complexity that is set by Magento by default. However, to change this, you really need to go into Magento dependency injection. And my module basically allows you to override this by default. So by simply going into the backend configuration, you can modify the depth and you can modify the complexity. And now the amazing thing is basically in my little example here, we were now playing around with a single query that had a complexity of about maybe 5, and then a depth of 4, simply counting the curly braces, while the default values within Magento are much higher. So this leads me also to say maybe that Magento by default has a query depth and a query complexity, plus it doesn't even have a thing like the GraphQL rate limiting to basically stop exploits from happening. So this is one of the first moments that I've been discussing this more openly towards a wider audience, because also I believe that this is going to be the next step within Magento to protect basically the GraphQL API in a better way. And at least, like, I've now open sourced 2 modules to help you along with that. Besides all of the modules that I've already been building that simply help you to extend upon the GraphQL endpoints of Magento itself by adding new stuff to it. But I really believe that basically the GraphQL rate limiting module and a custom GraphQL query limiter, even though the module name is pretty long, might be useful as soon as you bump into that you need to roll out a GraphQL based front end. If that's not the case, if you're not offering anything based upon GraphQL yet, that's also fine. You don't need to go the headless route, but then my strong recommendation would be to actually disable GraphQL nonetheless. Yeah, so I'm a little bit over time, I guess, but hopefully you found it interesting. All of my slides will be available later on. Yeah, I hope you found the things interesting. If you still have issues with the slides, feel free to approach me as well. I'm available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Slack channels, and etc. You'll be able to find me pretty easily. And otherwise than that, I'm not sure if there's time for questions, but I hope you enjoyed the talk anyway. And it's about time maybe for the next user.
Hi, Jisse. Thank you so much for the session. It was really, really helpful. So thank you so much for digging deep into it and taking so much time to get us the details.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, a pleasure, Jisse. I think we can just take 2 minutes or so for the question and answer, because I think people have already started posting questions on the Q&A section. So I think if you could just help them with the questions, we'll probably extend for like 2 to 5 minutes for the question and answer?
Yeah, for sure. One little issue though with my own environment is I don't see those Q&A sections. So
I
there's an
think
issue
it's
basically.
there, right on the bottom. There is a section for called Q&A. So are you
Yeah.
aware?
So the issue is basically and I can see it now. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So guys, if you guys have any questions, you can always post it on the question and answer section, and Jisse is here to answer your questions. So let's
Yep.
take 5 minutes of that time to post your questions over there.
Yeah, perfect. So there's already 3 questions out there right now. So the first one is from Sita. Can we send a query and mutation in a single request? The funny thing is GraphQL could, but Magento is not allowing you to. So Magento has a specific implementation of GraphQL, and that implementation is unable to handle queries and mutations in a single request. I'm not sure if that's actually going to change in the future, but as of yet, it's not possible. And I have to say, I find it really a pity because theoretically, by combining these two, a query and a mutation, you could do a mutation to modify the card and then do a query based upon that. However, most of the mutations that you can make in Magento, they have a return value as well. And that return value is kind of like the same thing as making a query, so that using that return of the mutation, you can still load in all of the JSON data that you want to. A second question, does Magento frontend use the GraphQL layer? So then we're assuming basically the old frontend. The old frontend would be based upon knockout, require, but also jQuery. And to my knowledge, basically Magento itself is not going to use that at all. So it might be that third-party extensions are going this way anyway, so that a third-party extension might make this choice to basically run a GraphQL query using jQuery because you can. But as of yet, I would say that's not the case yet. The other question is basically also like, what kind of, is it totally possible? And I would say that it's totally possible to deal with products and categories and a couple of other things. The only downside basically of this combination of the current front end and GraphQL is that the Magento front end has a session for its customer, for the checkout and a couple of other things. But those sessions of the Magento front end are not directly the same as the GraphQL session. So in GraphQL, we refer to tokens, a customer token, a checkout token, and the token and the normal session is not synchronized. However, it's underneath still the same technology. So what you could do is you could write your own custom module to synchronize the front-end session with the GraphQL token. And well, I've been playing around with that. So there's also on my GitHub pages, I'm not sure anymore what the name is, but something like literally sync the GraphQL token with the regular front end, a module like that. And that's like an early attempt to combine those two in the Magento front end. Vignesh Bala is also mentioning, hey, there's their tutorial available for getting started with Vue Storefront and GraphQL. Then the answer is basically no. Vue Storefront is basically one of the bigger competitors towards Magento. So Magento has offered this Magento PW Studio based on React. Vue Storefront has also built its own PWA technology, but then based upon Vue. But what they've chosen also is basically they started with the development of Vue Storefront 1 already before the GraphQL API of Magento was there. And because of this, actually, they've based the Vue Storefront API upon REST instead of GraphQL. And of course, they could have put it on the roadmap by saying like, okay, we're going to add Vue Storefront 1 with GraphQL support also on this roadmap. But then one of the main questions is why? Why would you go that way? Well, theoretically, if you're going to add GraphQL to some kind of existing environment, existing Vue or React app, then there's a lot of other changes that also follow. So the strategy of connecting components based upon React or Vue towards GraphQL is a totally different scenario of than basically connecting React components via REST to Magento. And because of that, actually the code base of Vue Storefront 1 itself is also not really fitting in that scenario. Vue Storefront Next is going to offer this out of the box. So interestingly enough, Vue Storefront Next, which is not going to be available for Magento right away, but Vue Storefront is focusing upon other cards like Shopware, Shopify, Silius, and etc. And they're first making that thing work, but because of some of these cards supporting GraphQL also out of the box, GraphQL support is going to be part of Vue Storefront Next version 2 kind of in the future. And then once that's going to work, and once Vue Storefront Next is going to be working successfully, then they're also going to make Vue Storefront Next compatible with GraphQL. So it is on the roadmap, but it is not on the roadmap of Vue Storefront 1. Does that mean that you can't add GraphQL to Vue Storefront 1? No, you can, because you can simply just follow tutorials how to add Apollo to Vue. And if that tutorial applies to Vue 2, then Vue 2 actually is used within Vue Storefront 1. I hope the numbers don't confuse you. But basically, simply following those general tutorials is good enough. So that's the third question in the Q&A section. And I'm also seeing a little chat here in the chat, somebody who couldn't post a question elsewhere. Should we use middleware for GraphQL? Interesting question, because Node middleware is basically a big story. I would say basically that middleware is interesting if it comes to supporting Elasticsearch, or when it comes to server-side rendering, which is a huge issue, or which is a huge challenge with React and Vue. So as soon as you bump into Elasticsearch connections or server-side rendering, having a middleware based upon Node and then supporting GraphQL as well definitely makes sense. But if the middleware is, if the question would be if the middleware is only needed for GraphQL, I'm not convinced yet, because all of the caching that could be going on within that middleware could be done in PHP as well. Theoretically, PHP is slower than Node. So if you would base that middleware upon Node, theoretically, then things become fast again. But it's kind of like a difficult scenario, and there's a lot of, well, there's basically a lot more work that you need to put into it to make it a success. So simply put, yes, it is possible. However, I would say that it's kind of like an advanced scenario. So get started with the basics first before you get to that advanced scenario. And I think that's the last question that we had. So I think it would be a good moment that I just shut up and give the word to Moam.
No, the details are very, very important, Jisse. So I think very few people can give the details. So we don't regret taking a little more time to listen to it. Thank you so much for the session.
Perfect.
And answering.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you guys for the patience. And again, let's move on to the next speaker without further ado. So we have Muliadi Jeo, and he's the founder and the chief technology officer for ICUBE Inc., one of the leading Magento solution partners in Asia Pacific. For the last 20 years, Muliadi has been working in an e-commerce area. His passion lies in the retail, especially in the topic of omni-channel and retail innovation. His past e-commerce projects include some of the well-known international brands such as Tom's Shoes, Relax the Back, Ray-Ban, Burr, Oprah Store, etc. And some of the local stores also include Body Shop, Hush Puppies, Waco, Lotte Mart, L'Occitane, and more. So he was also the CTO for several startups in Indonesia, such as Bobo Bobo and Shop Deca and VIP Plaza in the past. So thank you so much for accepting to be here, Muliadi. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a long intro, but thank you so much. Well, I'm not going to go through on the technical things tonight. I'm basically going to bring you a different journey altogether, basically try to understanding some of the interesting consumer behavior, what we can see in Southeast Asia. But before that, just a very quick intro. So my name is Muliadi Jeo. I'm from Indonesia, Jakarta. I used to be in the States for quite some times. And then moved back, and then having my own team now in Indonesia is about, about 80 something engineers now, really focusing on Magento. We also have our Meet Magento Indonesia every year. So if you guys have a time, probably not this year, but hopefully next year, everything starts to be normal again, and we can have again the events, and you can travel back, go to Jakarta and visit us for the event. That would be great. I'm kind of lucky enough, basically able to see the kind of two different kind of e-commerce. One, when I was in the States, that's where the e-commerce just starting off, maybe about 20 years ago. And then now when I go back to Asia, East Asia and in general e-commerce, besides China, which is much more mature, but the rest of the Southeast Asia, I will say the e-commerce just starting off. So we can actually see the contrast and the things, basically how the e-commerce behavior is kind of blending in between what we see in the Southeast Asia and what we see in the Western world, in Europe, in the United States. I think it's because I think the way that the global economy works, things is a little bit different now. It's when things seems like very separate between the world in the past, and now it's everything is actually much more closer. Not only from the industry, e-commerce, but from the entertainment, the way that people actually interaction. With us now in the Zoom, we can talk all over different world, talk together into this video conference like this. I think that's making the whole world much closer, and that's why the culture is kind of mixing between all the different words, and that's kind of so true what I can see from my experience. So these are all the key components that we're going to go through. Things that are kind of happening in Southeast Asia. Things that are actually driving the e-commerce itself. Obviously, when we talk about the e-commerce, we're talking about a lot of the young people driving the digital commerce, and I'll show you why. And that's basically driving the rest of the topics that we're going to talk today, basically mobile first innovations, social media and stuff like that. So let's start with the first one, which is kind of the younger audience that we have basically as the e-commerce buyers. It's kind of a topic that has been talking a lot in the United States, how it's getting younger and younger, the people that are actually active and actually making influence on how the purchasing buyer going to be. And in Southeast Asia, that's becoming such true even more, because it's such a young populations all over the Southeast Asia. This is kind of the stats over 2016 population, so it's just 4 years to go. If you can see the number of people that on between 0 and 30, that's like composed majority of the population. I think this is maybe a big contrast. In Netherlands and Europe, and like in Italy, I think this is kind of the flip side of it. But it's in Asia. This is so true that the younger populations really is the majority of the populations, and that's why they are so subjective into this digital transformation on the shopping behavior, and basically driving the whole changes. Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, Cambodia. I just picked the 8 Southeast Asia country, and it's all the same graph that we see over and over. It's the younger populations kind of become the dominant one. And then obviously when we talk about the millennials, we talk about younger audience, the same challenge that the US have right now, or even the other country have, is actually, it's happening the same, because this society, this new, what we call me society, is pretty much the same all across the world. I said, and they are getting, the same culture. They're watching the same YouTube. They having the same entertainment. They have the same access to the internet. So they also have the same behavior, limited budgets. Obviously they want to be different. Probably you can see more and more Instagram, and not only just Instagram, and they want to be, it's the story. It's the moment, and it's not just a picture of yesterday. It has to be what I'm doing now that being shown. It's even like a couple seconds in the video. everybody having story. I mean, it's come from Snapchat, and now everybody has story. Instagram has story. Facebook has story. Even WhatsApp has story. So because that's just the culture of the people love to tell more about themselves, the me society. I want to show you why I'm different and showing you what I like. And it's very, very focal as far as the customer behavior going to be. And then obviously some will argue about they are less loyal to the brand. I mean, obviously it will create a challenge because they are very subjecting to the price sensitive, moving from one brand to brand. But I think it's not about loyal or not loyal about the brand, but they are looking much more about value. So whenever they buy something, I think when I have a teenager son, so that whenever he buys something, he always looking like what is really valuable for him. And then that's basically what he chooses. If the brand can bring the value, then he will stick with that brand. So it's not matter about what brand and he like or not like, but it's all about what can he get. And that's very important things, part of their shopping experience. I think if you go to a lot of conference, they talk about experience. I think it's much, much more true when we're talking about the millennials. I mean, they like this experience. They like all these gimmicks. They like all these gamifications, basically. Things about making shopping fun. I mean, not only just buy the products, but it's the entire how to get into that products. I mean, things in Asia, I mean, they like getting promotions, not only just getting the promo code. I mean, in the US, maybe we just creating a lot of this extension. I know you guys do, some of you are developers, maybe just creating extension to create auto promo, but it's beyond that. I think in Asia shopping, they like to be like treasure hunting to find that promo code. Or maybe in the future, we're probably going to create like AR to get a promo code. It's just the fun part of the chasing of that promo code. It's more important than the actual discount on that promo code itself. So this has to be that experience that is going on. And that's making to the second part of it, because they are so self-centric. I mean, these young people, obviously, mobile is edifying this whole experience because it's a 24/7 access to go to. And then in some country, I think it's true also in India and also in a lot of the Asia country, it's not only mobile first. I think a lot of the topic in Europe and in United States talking about we have to start mobile first. But in Asia, like just in India as well, sometimes it's becoming a mobile only. I mean, that's the only option for them to shop. Some of them don't really even have computer at home. They probably only use a computer at work. Which is kind of funny story, like when we do a survey, initially when the e-commerce just started in Indonesia, they will say, okay, when is the time of people doing browsing the site? Oh, they browse almost every day. I mean, morning, afternoon, night, they browse. But when they purchasing, they only purchase during the working time, which in between 10 o'clock to 2 p.m. or during the break, basically when they work, because that's when the only time they have access to computer. And obviously they still don't trust enough to actually purchase on a mobile phone because of the internet is not good, or basically they don't trust enough with the connection and stuff like that. So they use the computer at work to actually purchase. So which is kind of funny. And then during weekend, when we see like Saturday, Sunday, there's no activity on the e-commerce site at all. I mean, usually just everything dropped. So it's kind of, but obviously now it's getting better, a little bit different now. Actually, a connection getting better, obviously, a lot more 4G. And I know a certain country now going through 5G, but I think that's going to help confidence level of them using their phone to actually purchase. So we can see a lot more people using apps. And that's kind of translate into the third one here, which is the culture of super apps. And that's kind of happening a lot only in Asia, I think, right now. I don't know about in India, maybe you guys also have the same culture, but definitely not in United States and Europe that I can see. But the whole concept of super apps is really like one app do everything. So basically, we have what we call like a Gojek. I don't know if you ever heard of them, or maybe in Singapore, Grab, G-R-A-B. Those like in the one app, it's, let's see if I have a screenshot. Yeah, I have a screenshot here. So it's like one app. You can just do transportation from Go Ride, Go Car. I don't know if you can read pretty well. And then you can book taxi on it. You can and actually order food. You can do like logistics sending items. You can find deals. You can top up your phone credit and things that you don't even see here. Like you can actually book massage, cleaning house, and everything. So it's literally like a one single apps that pretty much cover everything. And as far as like services and anything related in e-commerce, it's all into this one single apps. The other side on the right hand side here is another travel apps, which is like trying to do everything related to travel and then entertainment, basically from flight and hotels, the whole experience, even the food eats, trains, bus shuttle, the transfer, car rental, and even they're like watching movie and whatever funds in that city. So everything they try to sell in just one big super apps. And this is basically because it's like this cultural convenience. I think this happening in China as well. So it's making this more and more people just using the mobile apps and to do stuff. And they don't afraid to try the new stuff. All these young people, and they always push the boundary. I mean, QR code, something simple, and we probably like 10 years ago don't see it as some meaningful way beyond just a replacement of the barcode, but it's become everything now in Asia. I mean, when you say QR code, we're talking about payment, we're talking about finding product info, we're talking about exchange contact. Everything is basically a scan away in the QR code, which is kind of crazy. And this people, I mean, young people willing to try it and actually become a culture. And we can see this culture actually shifting actually in the United States now, more and more actually people adapting it. This is in China, obviously, where you can see people scanning QR code just to buy and to pay. And that's happened everywhere in Indonesia as well. I think that's kind of become like a de facto standard. So I will say if you're building a building extension, I mean, I think building a QR code out of Magento product, I think that's another that very useful and can be used quite easily for a lot of, maybe if you want to build a PWA, maybe build some extension to be exposing that. Some idea, I mean, but I mean, if it here in the United States, you can see they are start to mimicking what happening in Asia. I mean, Walmart try to do the same things here with the QR code, virtual toy store, Walmart, but that's kind of a simple, not high tech, I will say just kind of low tech, but it's get things done really well because inside the QR code, there's so much information that you can actually put inside the QR code beyond just a typical barcode that very limited. I think now they have like 3D QR code and stuff like that, make it even greater. But I can foresee more and more these interactions basically with the mobile. It's becoming de facto. I think everything that we build, I mean, I think things kind of aligning really well. I think with the Jisse presentation about the GraphQL and the PWA, it's everything gearing toward this mobile first or mobile only audience, which is getting much, much more important right now. And then the speed of the presenting the content is much, much important. And you want the flexibility of this experience to be built very customly. I mean, we kind of like going from the spectrum of everything done in the template nice now into the other spectrum of everybody want a custom experience and complete freedom to create like a very, very unique experience out of the apps and out of the e-commerce. So this kind of the pendulum of the spectrum is actually going the other way around. And all the tools actually helping us to actually prepare that coming. And then the next level is obviously about social media itself. It's changing the role. I mean, I think in the past, we only talking about Facebook, putting an advertising on social media. Some people still talking about social commerce in the old way where you post a product in the Facebook and then help people will click on it and start buying it maybe. But now I think it's a much, much more challenging in the social media way. We are talking about not only just a static post, which is like can stay for longer. We're not talking about Snapchat story that only exists for, I don't know, 1 day, less than 24 hours. And you have to keep engaging with the customers very fast, rapidly. And you have to continue to come up with new fun stuff, stories and stuff like that to continue to engage. And then I'll see a lot of the brand even in Indonesia now using stories a lot. They continue having new story every day. And then basically not only just telling about product, but they have to be able to tell something more than just the product. It has to be the story. And then that's basically get to link into the product itself. So I mean, this is just one of example of my client basically doing like a lot of story about the Valentine. No, this is a Independence Day sales. Asia loves sales, so I think a lot of the story about either sales or new product and stuff like that. But you can see this is like using Instagram basically within the story. You can just like clicking up and then basically able to go to Magento site and start buying. And I think if we combine it now with the PWA and stuff like that, I think this experience even can be much, much more fluid happening between the two. I mean, the social media and the actual website. So that's about the social media, and obviously it's even harder now. I think it's getting started into the video. I think the new trend now that we all just look into become very, very popular. TikTok has been taking the world by storm, from Asia to India to China to US. Every country in the world is engaging on TikTok, which is amazingly something that we never see before. How fast this kind of culture change that's basically replicating to the rest of the world. And that's kind of the massive social media that we see. It's a changing social media, but it's much faster also. It's go into the rest of the world. So video interaction going to be the next, and how that going to be basically how can we use it to actually optimizing our e-commerce. That's going to be another challenge that we have to face. It's because it's also very quick, short span attention. I think that's the kind of the summary of what we can see from all these young people is this short attention, and how can we get that short attention of them. And another area that basically I would like to cover today is about the payment innovation. I think that's also kind of funny. It started in Asia because of the Asia doesn't use like in the Western world where credit card is kind of like the de facto. I think when we create extension in US, and we barely see people creating a new extension for Visa, for whatever payment gateway. Usually the bank or the payment gateway itself will create the extension, and that's it. And then they come up with Stripe, and PayPal, which allow you to innovate the payment a little bit, but that's still controlled by Stripe and PayPal from the API perspective. But in Asia, I think it's also true in India as well. I see there's a digital payment that crop up that basically that we have to anticipate and actually innovate around it. And when we do with Magento, I think this is the nice thing about Magento is we are able to basically create or easily to adopt all this payment. Maybe it's going to be harder on PWA, I heard, with the GraphQL limitation, but nevertheless, that's kind of the freedom that we're going to get, basically able to create a shopping cart that able to use all the payment that the client will use. And I think the lingo is about fintech. I mean, they don't just talk about payment. It's called, the finance technology in general is becoming much bigger part of the shopping experience. Not only just payment, they also might have a micro loan basically that allow people to basically buy now, pay later kind of things. It's good for customer, and they usually the fintech throw in a lot of, like I said, sales bonus and then discount into the payment so that people will use the payment. But customer love it. Merchant got a big headache because it's now have to support like tons of the payment that you have to support on your websites. Imagine like in Indonesia, we actually can deal with like this many payment methods basically that we have to put into the shopping cart. That's on the left hand side. That's just like the Indonesia payment method that you will see that is available typically on every e-commerce site that want to support as much of payment method. We have the traditional credit card payment. We have the ATM bank transfers. We have each bank have their own kind of new payment that we can do directly to the bank. We can use the shop like a 7-Eleven, pay through that basically, and so on and so on. And you have GoPay, basically that's the new technology fintech through the riding company, and it's just, and this never stops. This is just an option that continue to grow. And the funny thing in US is starting to increase as well, and this kind of being replicated outside Indonesia as well, where basically the type of payments getting more and more as well. I mean, in the past, you're just going to accept credit card and that's it. Now, when you have a Magento in the US, now you can turn on Klarna, Afterpay, and then now there's Amazon Pay, there's Apple Pay, there's Samsung Pay, there's Google Pay. Who knows? I mean, now maybe after this, there's like Huawei Pay. Everybody come up there with their own pay on every phone. So then you have to support all of them, and you have to detect what phone they have and what kind of payment you have to make it happen in the phone. I mean, when they're browsing on the phone. So that's might happening pretty easily soon. So and that's because basically challenge on the whole UI UX things. Basically, how can you present this many payment in a nice way in the checkout process without overwhelming the customers? I mean, yeah, we just do like something very quickly here, doing a payment grouping. I mean, something that Magento doesn't have, and we have to create it. Unfortunately, because there's so many payment, like if you put that as a list, it's like 20 long lists of payment in the whole checkout. Just doesn't look nice. So creating some kind of payment grouping does make it a little bit sanity there, just to show you. I mean, so this is when you deal with this kind of like a localized solution, when you start looking into Magento applying to different local. This is kind of the things that we have to pay attention on. Really, what does it needed to be on that locale? Not only just talking about languages and translation, but really adapting a lot of the whole shopping experience to that specific local country too. So this is kind of one thing, easy thing. And then the next one is probably the topic that's much more sensitive from the business perspective. From technology, I think it's no brainer. I mean, when I say sleeping with the enemy, are we talking about the big guy? I mean, we see all those super apps and the big marketplace guy that basically dominates the Asia's e-commerce. So it's looking at this in Asia market. This is the entire big marketplace that's dominant pretty much every e-commerce activity in any country. I mean, we haven't seen like e-commerce player that can be beating any of this marketplace anytime soon. And I don't think it's going to be ever happen. I mean, in US, probably they're still able to chance people, oh, I don't want to sell on Amazon, I still can survive. But even that's getting harder and harder. In Asia, from day one, you have to work with all of this. So there's not even an option for you to not integrate and selling on these marketplaces. I probably sense it's also true in India as well. I mean, becoming very important to be able to sell on the marketplace like Amazon. I think in India is quite big right now as well. So how, and Magento realized that, like in the US, they're now starting creating this whole connector into Amazon and start to play nice, basically able to push Magento into the Amazon. I think that's kind of become a very important features that need to be happen when you roll out Magento. You're able to import, export, order to this marketplace, pushing catalog inventory into those marketplaces, kind of features that you have to have. So, I mean, this is why omni-channel in Asia market, in retailers in Asia, and specifically, it has to happen, because you can't only survive by just selling in one place. I mean, you just have to be able to exceed on all of these channels to kind of successfully in playing in the e-commerce digital. I mean, selling in e-commerce. And just one of the clients that we have, basically just to show, I mean, they have to be present on all this marketplace. They have a website that's quite successful, but they also have to be an official store in Lazada. And also here is Tokopedia is kind of one of the largest marketplace in Indonesia. So they have to be exist on both. And it's a nightmare if you don't have an omni-channel system, and if you don't try to integrate this process. It's a very nightmare, because you have to not only splitting the stock, the items, you have to invest on people, on managing on each of this place. Customer service has to be different on each of these marketplaces. It's basically, it's a logistic nightmare in general. I mean, to run the business across this many marketplaces. but it's a must. It's unavoidable. I mean, and then this is how kind of the whole positioning your customers in the middle is kind of important. You have to have the strategy on how can we use this marketplace as to acquire new customers and building this whole strategy around getting the customer from the marketplace, but then maintaining your customer inside your own websites. How can you unify the entire experience? That's like, I think, a lot of things that can be built in terms of like the continuity between the Magento e-commerce website and the marketplace activity. There's still a lot of functionality that we can build to make it much more fluid, promotional and stuff like that. And lastly, that I want to give you here, it's a short presentation, but openly just open up a lot more kind of what can we anticipate and from the, what we call new economy. This is things that we have to kind of watching that keep changing now in our world. I mean, in the world of logistics, obviously we have, in the US, we have Uber, we have Lyft, I mean, for the driving person. But I mean, the same concept of that economy sharing, when they bring it to the Asia, they're not only just carrying passengers, they're also carrying actually goods. And it's become actually a whole new logistic options. Just amazing, because like country like US just starting up with the same day services and stuff like that. And it's usually very expensive to do same day services. But country like Indonesia, in Jakarta, we have so many what we call Gojek that I mentioned before. It's like riding motorcycle and basically able to drive through the town and then deliver items. And that can basically deliver items within Jakarta within 2 or 3 hours everywhere, same day. So now all of a sudden, a same day delivery become a common already offering to almost all this, even small merchant able to do that. Just amazing how this technology basically changing. We basically have a client that do, maybe heard of their name, Royal Canin. It's like the pet food, the dog food, cat food kind of business. So they're not allowed to sell directly to the customers, but through the Magento and all the modification that we do, basically we're able to leveraging this logistic Gojek, so that we can basically, whenever an order comes in, we kind of find the closest store that actually is selling that particular pet food, and basically we book the driver basically to pick up the items from that store and then ship it to the customers, and it all happened on same day delivery, which kind of, that's how fluent the customer experience will be. And then obviously from the sense of supplier and stuff like that, it's kind of changing. Now we have a lot of big players from the B2B perspective and all into the digital. So now we have all of a sudden massive choices of supplier doing drop shipping and stuff like that. So it's making like the whole technology integrations play a big part of it to make it happen. And I talk about the fintech microloan making much easier for everybody to buy anything. So these are things that basically gonna continue to innovate and continue to change the way we buy stuff. And also in the marketing influence is going to change. I mean, before we always looking for like a big artist, like somebody famous to do the marketing influence. Now anybody can be a blog, a video blog. Anybody can create a YouTube channel, have a lot of follower, and just simply by opening a box, showing products, or doing like a makeup training, everybody can have become like a micro influencer. And this has become a lot more to tap in. And the flexibility that we have in Magento that we able to build and engaging with all this different technology, we have to continue to basically aware of all of them and then able to basically leverage them as part of the full solution into the e-commerce, because that's kind of becoming a important key for the business to success, to leveraging all this new area. So yeah, I mean, that's a very quick presentation. So, I mean, it's 20 minutes and I'll open up for discussion. Hopefully that will give you a new kind of visibility of view on like how e-commerce kind of look like, and open up a new basically challenge and new innovations basically in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muliadi. It was a wonderful session. I think, guys, if you have questions, you can always post it on the question and answer section, and Muliadi is here to help you out with the answers. Let's wait for a minute or two and see how many people come up with the questions, Muliadi. All right, so I think if there are questions, probably I'll just get them and mail it to you or something, or probably I'll let Srija do it. And thank you so much for the session, Muliadi. It was a
Thank
wonderful
you.
session, really, really interactive. Thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. So I think it is time to wind up the session right now. So it's been a wonderful journey that it's almost the fourth session, Magento Master Series we've been having, and it's been bi-weekly. And Srija and Mohan has been doing a wonderful job organizing the sessions, and we've been having great masters as speakers in this session. So and Muliadi, I've seen Muliadi as an active participant in a lot of our previous sessions. So thank you so much for joining us, taking the time here. And we had wonderful speakers, yes, Jisse and Muliadi. So both of you gave us a wonderful session. And guys, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll be getting back to you with updates of the next session very soon. And as a lot of your, based on a lot of your requests, we'll be posting all the sessions on our YouTube channel. So you can find the sessions there in the Magento Masters web series. So thank you so much for joining us. Pleasure.